This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform which allows entrepreneurs to create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host Karl, and today we're talking about Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, the saviour of mothers, and the man that taught us all to wash our goddamn hands. And I should note that, like all the videos here on Biographics, this one is based on a script submitted to us by a member of our writing team. This one in particular being Arnoldo Teodrani. Find them on socials, like link below, alongside my own if you're so interested. What do heroes do? When you think of a heroic deed, only the most extraordinary acts may come to mind. We would not consider mundane, daily occurrences to have any inherent heroic qualities. Every day, millions of mothers give birth. This is part of life, of nature, a recurring pattern, hardly the definition of some epic struggle or achievement. And yet, until relatively recently, the simple, recurring, natural act of giving birth caused the death of up to 1 in every 3 mothers. And that's true heroism right there, risking your life to give birth to another. Even today, childbirth carries some pretty serious risks, but the maternal mortality rates have steadily plummeted since the late 1840s, when an unlikely hero produced an unlikely heroic act. A simple, banal procedure which takes no more than 30 seconds to complete: washing your goddamn hands. This is the pretty tragic life story of Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, the father of hospital hygiene, but best remembered as the saviour of mothers. Ignaz Semmelweis was born July 1st, 1818 in Buda, then part of the Austrian Empire, today Budapest, in Hungary. He was the 5th of 10 children born to Josef and Theresia, a couple of German Jewish immigrants. But Joseph and Theresia owned a grocery store which afforded them a pretty good standard of living and allowed them to send all their children to school. Ignaz in particular attended the Catholic Gymnasium in Buda, where he graduated in 1835. The young man then moved to Vienna, where he enrolled in law school at the University of Vienna, the capital of the empire. Ignaz had picked law upon his father's insistence, but soon realised that a life in the courtrooms was not for him. In 1838 he was invited to attend an anatomy class by a friend who was a medical student, which made for a rather morbid playdate, but it sparked in him a love for medicine. That year he moved to part of Pest, now part of Budapest, and signed up for medical studies. Ignaz then transferred back to Vienna in 1840, where he eventually obtained his doctorate of medicine in 1844. Now Dr. Semmelweis, he first applied to work in a clinic for internal medicine, but was not that successful. He then decided to specialise in obstetrics, a field with less internal competition, and in July 1846 he obtained an appointment as assistant to Professor Johann Klein, the head of the first obstetrical clinic in the General Hospital, a teaching facility in Vienna. At the time, the General Hospital offered free services to pregnant mothers, which made it a pretty attractive venue for underprivileged women to give birth in. In return, the patients agreed to be the subjects of training to both medical and midwifery students. Now the hospital included 2 separate clinics. The first, managed by Professor Klein with Semmelweis' assistants, was dedicated to the training of future doctors. The second was entirely run by midwives and their junior students, and depending on the day of admission, a mother-to-be could be assigned to either the first or the second clinic. But the wise mothers of Vienna had soon realised that it was in their best interest to be admitted to the second clinic, the one in the care of midwives. And you might be wondering, what's the deal here? Well, there was a pretty sound statistical reasoning for it. The first clinic had a maternal mortality rate of up to 18%, while the mortality rate in the second clinic was less than 2%. In other words, almost 1 in 6 mothers giving birth in the doctor's clinic would not survive to hold their own babies in their arms. The main cause of this appalling situation was puerperal fever, known as childbed fever, which I'll be saying for the rest of the video because puerperal fever is kind of hard to say, and I get marble mouth a lot when I've got to say a lot of these medical words. This was the leading cause of maternal mortality in Europe in the early 1800s, with death rates as high as 35%. Nowadays, we now know that childbed fever is the result of an infection caused by Streptococcus bacteria, which may enter the mother's bloodstream and cause septicemia or blood poisoning. Back in the 1840s, however, the impact of bacteria and other transmissible pathogens and diseases was yet to be understood and formalised. French physician Louis Pasteur would publish his findings on germ theory only in 1861. It would take him 6 further years to demonstrate the link between germs and diseases. His German colleagues, Robert Koch, in 1876, proved that the specific microbes cause specific illnesses. So this was a long way off yet. Instead, the common view in the mid-1840s was that diseases such as childbed fever were caused by environmental factors such as temperature, humidity, or simply miasma, an unspecified toxic odour or putrid air which wafted around, causing patients to fall ill. Medical students and fully fledged doctors did not question such unproven theories, least of all Professor Klein, a staunch conservative and stickler for red tape whose ears were deaf to any form of innovation. But this was not the case for the hero of our story, Ignaz Semmelweis. One of his duties as an assistant to Klein was to keep hospital records in order. Thanks to his access to the statistical data, he immediately noticed that the mortality rate was much lower in the second clinic than in the first one. Moreover, he found out that many women preferred to give birth in the street or at home rather than being admitted to the doctor-run services. And I think nothing puts in perspective how dire things were at the time more than the fact that expectant mothers literally had a higher chance of surviving giving birth in the middle of the street than they did in a hospital full of doctors. Or, as Semmelweis would put it, to me it appeared logical that patients who experienced street births would become ill at least as frequently as those who delivered in the clinic. What protected those who delivered outside the clinic from these disruptive, unknown, endemic influences? The conundrum of constant death playing backdrop to the cries of newborn babies and dying mothers deeply concerned Ignaz to the point that, and I quote, it made him so miserable that life seemed worthless. Clearly there was something at play, and so the inquisitive young doctor set out to investigate. So I'm sure whatever I was just talking about was very, very interesting, but it's time for a word from today's sponsor, Squarespace, which means, of course, it's time for the sponsor anteater. Let's go, guys. Tell me more about Squarespace, Nisha.
So Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform where you can create yourself a beautiful website.
A website that makes websites. Like what we're going to have next, a website that makes websites that makes websites.
Website inception. So Squarespace allows pretty much anyone to create a website, so from professional to entrepreneurs.
What about idiots like myself?
Of course, yes.
Yes.
Another good thing about Squarespace is you can add extensions, so you can add stuff to your website like third-party tools.
Well, I'm always a fan of anything that lets me add widgets.
With Squarespace, you can use it to blog, engage with the audience, sell your products or time, and with that, you can also set up email campaigns so you can, basically contact your subscribers.
Which might not sound very important, but considering this is being made on YouTube, a platform where even if you click the bell and subscribe, you most likely won't see the content you subscribe to see, having the ability to directly contact your audience is invaluable to anyone who wants to, create content online.
A good thing about Squarespace as well is you can be completely creative, but if you're not feeling very creative, you can use their flexible website templates.
Which is great because while boundless, endless choice is certainly an attractive idea, sometimes you just want to be able to pick from within a certain, subcategory of choices. Like when you scroll on Netflix, that is too much. So thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial when you're ready to launch. Go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% on your first purchase of a website/domain. Use the code Biographics. I'm going to end the sponsor spot with a bonus fun fact not found elsewhere within the video. So guys, would you like to hear a bonus fact about Albert Einstein?
Yay!
So did you know that Albert Einstein used to solve equations wearing a pair of pink fuzzy slippers and sometimes his wife's shoes?
Why do I feel like that's something you would do? With the slippers anyway. Oh, there we go. That's why.
Semmelweis took a fairly rigorous approach to understanding and discerning what factor was causing the difference in death rates. The first suspects were overcrowding and climate, and he soon ruled them out as both clinics were equally as crowded and had similar environmental conditions. They were both hospitals. Next in line was birthing positions, because he noticed that midwives would often encourage women to give birth on their sides, whereas the doctors in the first clinic would tell them to do it on their backs. He tried to adopt the same practice in the first clinic, and there were no positive effects on the mortality rate, so he also abandoned that idea. And the third possible suspect was psychological terror, which sounds kind of ridiculous until you realise what would happen in the first clinic when a woman died during childbirth. So whenever a woman died of childbed fever in the doctor's ward, a priest would walk through the clinic, followed by an altar boy ringing a bell. Semmelweis theorised that the gloomy spectacle terrorised other patients to the point they developed a lethal fever. Semmelweis asked the priest to lose the bell and take a different route, but as you might expect, it did not impact mortality, although it probably made things a little cheerier in the ward full of, dying people and expectant mothers who were terrified that a doctor was going to kill them during childbirth. Detective Semmelweis could just not break this case, and as his frustrations grew, he decided he needed to clear his mind. The doctor asked for a period of leave and travelled to Venice to recover. Upon his return in April 1847, Semmelweis learned that his good friend and colleague Jacob Kolechka had died while working at the General Hospital. As Semmelweis examined his friend's autopsy file, everything fell into place. It appeared that Jacob had died from symptoms very similar to those of childbed fever, and furthermore, those symptoms had started to develop after he'd accidentally wounded himself with a scalpel while performing a routine autopsy. This meant that childbed fever could affect anybody, not just mothers-to-be, and that Kolechka had somehow been contaminated by his exposure to a dead body. Semmelweis thus concluded that childbed fever was caused by some unknown, and I quote, cadaverous material, which doctors and students carried on their hands after performing autopsies. Needless to say, midwives in the second clinic were not involved in doing autopsies, and therefore patients fared much better. And this was a pretty brutal wake-up call, paradoxical and infinitely sad at the same time. The very people who'd sworn an oath to protect, to treat the mothers of Vienna and to safely deliver their babies were also, inadvertently, the cause of their deaths. Now it was time to find a solution against this unknown killer, this unspecified cadaverous material. And when I say a solution, I mean an actual proper chemical solution of water and chlorinated lime, aka calcium hypochlorate, a compound now used commonly in things like household bleach. Dr. Semmelweis had no idea that childbed fever was caused by the Streptococcus bacterium because no doctor at the time had any clue what bacterium was, but he had correctly guessed that the chlorinated solution worked wonders at removing the putrid smell of necrotic tissue off the hands of doctors and trainees. From then on, Semmelweis instructed all medical personnel at the first clinic that they had to wash their hands after performing an autopsy and before attending to a childbirth. And that was it. People simply had to wash their hands. That's all it took to save lives. A gesture which sounds so painfully obvious to our modern ears, but was not exactly well received at the time. So our hero's insight appeared truly groundbreaking in 19th century Vienna, and yet there were some interesting precedents as reported by Dr. Julius Bauer, writing for the journal California Medicine in May 1963. So as early as 1795, Dr. Alexander Gordon in Aberdeen, Scotland recommended the burning of bed linens used by patients infected with childbed fever. He even advised that doctors and nurses wash their hands and fumigate their tools. Then in 1829, Dr. Robert Collins in Dublin, Ireland fought childbed fever by filling his hospital wards with chlorine gas. Dr. Collins' work was cited by American doctor Oliver Wendell Holmes in his 1843 article, The Contagiousness of Childbed Fever. Sadly, all these remained fairly isolated cases with no follow-up and no changes to regular medical practice. What was worse is that these predecessors of Semmelweis's were met with ostracism, even abuse, from the mainstream medical community. Would Dr. Semmelweis be more successful at breaking the stale and lethal practices of Austrian doctors? Spoilers, not really. Initially, it appeared as though our good doctor had achieved enormous success. In April 1847, the mortality rate at the first clinic peaked at 18.3%, after Semmelweis introduced, remember, just simply washing your hands for a few seconds after shoving your hand into a dead body. In May, rates started to drop. In June, it was at 2.2%. In July, 1.2%. And for 2 months, in early 1848, the mortality rate in the first clinic was down to 0%. A good chum from medical school, Ferdinand von Hebra, who was the editor of the medical journal, reported these astounding findings in December 1847 and then again in April 1848. Von Hebra encouraged his friend Ignaz to write further articles and hold scientific talks to disseminate his findings. Those findings being having your hands covered in pieces of dead body was not healthy for healthy people when they got put inside of them. But Ignaz refused to do so for reasons debated to this day. It may have been a lack of interest in academic exposure, a lack of self-confidence in public speaking, or just simply an inability to speak or write fluently in German. Or perhaps Semmelweis was more interested in doing his damn job rather than reporting about his work. And he did his job very, very well, formalising a new protocol in 1848 stating that all medical instruments had to be washed in the chlorinated solution that he developed. That year, however, Semmelweis was to meet some pretty fierce opposition from the medical establishment, and his staunchest critic was his own boss, Professor Johann Klein. Klein fiercely contested the new hand-washing protocols, claiming that the plummeting mortality rate were the result of his own innovation, a new ventilation system he had introduced at Vienna General Hospital. In general, Klein and other doctors of the old guard were still rallying around the outdated theories of miasma, so just illness just kind of floating around where people are sick, and were offended at the suggestion that their hands were unclean. There was literally the argument that a gentleman's hands never need to be washed because they're always clean, because you are a gentleman. And it's also worth noting that Semmelweis's nationality did play a part in the criticism he faced. In March 1848, Vienna was shaken by a constitutionalist uprising, followed in April by a similar insurrection in Hungary. This latter revolution also had an independent agenda. Therefore, it was only natural for a middle-aged, reactionary Austrian professor to come to loggerheads with a young, progressive Hungarian doctor. Moreover, while Semmelweis was not involved in politics, his brothers had actually joined the insurgency, so that didn't exactly help his case. According to Sonja Schreiner from the University of Vienna, writing in 2020, Semmelweis was heavily ostracized, not only because of his medical theories and practices, but also because he had introduced them, and I quote, "at the wrong place, that being the dangerous, conservative, nationalistic and anti-Semitic academic community of Vienna, at the wrong time, that being around the revolutionary year of 1848, with the wrong political orientation, that being democratic and open-minded, and then the wrong roots, Hungarian-born and a Jewish-sounding name." Ignaz and his ideas on hospital hygiene did have their supporters, chiefly among them the women who didn't die, but also the younger generation of doctors and medical students. The latter category, however, had been heavily involved in the March uprisings in Vienna, which may have played a part in the uncompromising reaction from the old guard of medical professors. Eventually, the duel between Klein and Semmelweis was won by the more senior contestant. In 1849, Professor Klein refused to renew Semmelweis's contract as assistant professor, effectively demoting him. After working another year at General Hospital, Semmelweis left Vienna and returned to his native Hungary, taking a similar position at the St. Rochus Hospital in Pest. And guess what? As soon as Semmelweis clocked in, he realised that childbed fever was just as rampant there as in Vienna. The doctor rolled up his sleeves and washed his hands and asked all his colleagues to do the same. By 1855, childbed fever had been virtually eliminated from the hospital, with a maternal mortality rate of just 0.85%. And surely no one would complain against the results of this magnitude, right? Right? So the problem was, as usual, the influence of previous generations of well-respected professors. In this case, the methods theorised by one Ede Florian Burley, the professor of obstetrics at the University of Pest. Burley had died in 1854, but apparently most obstetricians still swore by his idea that childbed fever was caused by uncleanliness of the bowel. Their weapon of choice then was not hand-washing, but rather enemas. So despite enormous pressure related to his day-to-day struggles, Semmelweis did find the energy to change his life around the late 1850s. In 1857, he married Marie Weidenhofer and the two had 5 children. Unfortunately, 2 of them died at a very young age, one of them from hydrocephalus. And then in 1858, he finally caved to his friend's suggestions and started publishing accounts of his work. Publishing, amongst other things, a pretty, direct titled piece called "The Difference in Opinion Between Myself and the English Physicians Regarding Childbed Fever." And then in 1861 he followed this up with his main work, "The Etiology Concept of Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever." So yeah, he wasn't exactly, being subtle in his frustration with the old guard. So from the pages of this book, Semmelweis vehemently attacked those who criticise his methods, despite the data and evidence being clearly on his side. You only have to look at a mortality rate jumping from 18% to 0% to know that something changed. And his frustrations were completely understandable, especially since, rather, depressingly, the maternal mortality rate had started to rise again after he left Vienna General Hospital. In autumn of 1860, it reached an unprecedented high of 35%. Remember, when Semmelweis was there, it had been 0. Semmelweis's work, however, failed to break through the rubble wall of medical conservatism. This was not only due to its content, but its style, and according to a 2004 article in the British Medical Journal, the book was, and I quote, "badly written and poorly received by the medical establishment," and it generally garnered pretty unfavourable reviews, even though its main takeaway was, wash bloody hands! The same paper we just quoted from in the British Medical Journal also points out that Dr. Semmelweis lacked, and again and I quote, "change agent skills," and pointing out 2 main flaws. First of all, the doctor had waited too long to publish his findings. Second, he completely lacked diplomacy and rudely antagonised those who disagreed with him without trying to take them to his side, which, again, completely fair given that, he was right. For example, he wrote these lines to his rival, Dr. Hofrath. "Should you, Herr Hofrath, without having disproved my doctrine, continue to train your pupils against it, I declare before God and the world, you are a murderer, and the history of childbed fever would not be unjust to you if it memorialised you as the medical Nero." Again, completely fair, but probably not the best way to win hearts and minds, especially when the people you're arguing with literally hold the hearts and minds of your patient in their hands sometimes. The The British medical journal piece concludes that in his quest to drive change, Semmelweis used all the wrong tactics, including public humiliation, excessive arrogance, and angry outbursts, which, again, understandable given that he was right. And it's impossible not to empathise with Dr. Semmelweis, and you can only imagine the intense frustration that would result from watching up to a third of young expectant mothers die, basically due to the pig-headedness and stubbornness of your own colleagues. And as you might expect, this frustration eventually took its toll on Semmelweis's mental health. So around 1861, his wife Maria and his friends noticed that Semmelweis had become increasingly erratic, moody, and had alternating periods of deep depression and cognitive decline, with angry outbursts directed at rivals and friends alike. And the former of those is pretty understandable given that they were killing people because they wouldn't wash their hands. And the most agreed upon explanation for this mental decline is the simplest one. The poor doctor simply suffered from mental burnout and exhaustion caused by overwork, frustration, and just sheer, whatever that emotion is, just the world in general. Dr. Julius Bauer, writing for California Medicine, refers to the autopsy performed on Dr. Semmelweis, pointing out symptoms compatible with syphilis. And this infectious disease can cause general paralysis in its late stages, a severe neuropsychiatric disorder which may have been responsible for the doctor's mental deterioration. This hypothesis is realistic, as many obstetricians at the time contracted syphilis from their patients, because they didn't wash their hands. According to medical journal author Greg Stillig-Seidel, however, syphilis is not to blame. Semmelweis may have suffered from diabetes instead, which exacerbated his mental burnout. Despite this downward spiral, some of Semmelweis's colleagues and friends stuck by him. In July 1865, Ignaz and his assistant, Dr. Bathory, took a trip to Vienna to meet with an old friend, Dr. von Hebra. The three spent some time at von Hebra's house and then went to a newly opened sanatorium, directed by the famed Dr. Riedel. As Semmelweis was in conversation with Riedel, von Hebra and Bathory quietly took leave, unnoticed by Dr. Semmelweis. So Dr. Semmelweis also wanted to leave as he had some patients to see in Vienna, and that's when he realised his friends had committed him to a psychiatric asylum for his own good. So Semmelweis, when he tried to leave the hospital and the clinic attendants tried to restrain him, became quite understandably annoyed and frustrated. So a furious Semmelweis put up such a fight that in the end it took some 6 orderlies to put him in a straitjacket and lock him in a dark room. Again, because all he wanted to do is get people to wash their hands. The doctor would not spend a long time at Riedel's sanatorium. It would later emerge that one of his fingers was injured, perhaps as a result of the fight with the orderlies, or maybe an older wound resulting from a gynecological operation. Whatever the cause, the wound became infected, then gangrenous, causing the onset of septicemia. On August 13, 1865, the doctor who had sacrificed his sanity for the prevention of disease via hygiene died of blood poisoning caused by a wound to his finger. Dr. Semmelweis's brilliant insights and his staunch dedication to the well-being of mothers-to-be were fully recognised only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur first, and then Robert Koch later, among others, popularised the concept of germ theory. Hospital hygiene and hand-washing were no longer considered outrageous practices which offended the dignity of doctors, but finally achieved their status as simple, practical solutions which could save thousands upon thousands of lives. As stated by the World Health Organization, and I quote, "Appropriate hand hygiene is the single most effective action to stop the spread of infection and disease." Maternal mortality rates nowadays vary between 12 per 100,000 live births per year in high-income countries and 430 per 100,000 in low-income countries. As for the cause of those deaths, between 2.1% and 11.6% can be ascribed to childbed fever. And while any amount of death is a tragedy, the fact that we've gone from mortality rates of up to 35% to 12 in 100,000 in less than a couple hundred years is nothing short of a miracle. And of course, more can be done to fight maternal death, especially in lower income countries, and more can still be done to combat the spread of infections in and outside of hospitals. And sometimes it doesn't take all that much. You only need to wash your hands. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like. If you've got anything to say about it, leave a comment below. Maybe another subject you'd like us to cover, or another person whose life you think is particularly interesting and deserves its own Biographics episode. If you want to see more content like this, subscribe for more. And as always, I'd like to wish everybody out there the day that they deserve. And yeah, just wash your hands. It's such a simple thing. I love that hand sanitizer everywhere now.